I'm Caroline Mercer, 36, founder and CEO of Mainspring Equity, a firm managing over $3 billion in private capital. Though few outside the inner circles of financial litigation know my name, I prefer it that way. I live alone in a penthouse in Chicago's West Loop, a few blocks from the river, but several lifetimes from where I started. My mornings are quiet coffee at 5:30, inbox cleared by 6, Bloomberg muted on the television. I've built my world in grayscale, steel, glass, and concrete, clean, predictable, unsentimental. It wasn't always this way. Once, I bore a different name and lived in Denver. Daughter of construction tycoon Russell Langford, Langford Development had been in the family for 3 generations, known for highway bids, government housing contracts, and a ruthless aversion to outside interference. I spent my 20s working beneath the Langford name, managing legal strategy and risk during a period when the company teetered between profit and collapse. We landed the Texas municipal contract under my lead, our first out-of-state project. In 15 years, it salvaged our books and gave us leverage in 3 regional markets. Then came the board vote. It was a Tuesday, cold, dry. The kind of Denver winter that cracked skin and silenced ambition. I wore navy wool and a braided bun, carried 3 binders of risk-adjusted projections in my arms, and stood in a room where no one asked to hear them. My father cleared his throat, smiled without conviction, and handed operational control to Elliot, my younger brother, freshly removed from a failed retail venture and years of unsteady site work. The reason given was tradition. The real reason hung unspoken, like the heavy chandelier above the oak table. Langford men inherit, Langford women advise. No one met my. I remember the sound of my heels against marble as I left the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I knew what silence could do better than noise ever could. They moved me into a shared office with 2 junior paralegals. My name vanished from client correspondence. The desk they gave me still had someone else's initials scratched into the wood. I handed in my resignation the following Friday. No press release, no farewell drinks, no attempt to make it palatable. I left a letter short and signed on my father's desk before dawn and walked out before the building filled. 12 years passed. They never called, never wrote, until last week. A plain white envelope. No return address. Inside was a formal letter requesting my attendance at an emergency strategic meeting for Langford Development, now hemorrhaging capital and facing court-mandated restructuring. They didn't know who I was now or what I had become, but they would. The first year after I left Denver, I said almost nothing about what happened. I told new colleagues I'd left for broader horizons. When recruiters asked why I had no recommendations from Langford, I shrugged. Let them think I was difficult or proud or ungrateful. None of it mattered. What mattered was what came next. I took a sublease in a warehouse loft off Canal Street. My savings weren't generous, but they were enough to build the structure of something real. I kept the blinds down, the phone silent, and moved in the margins of the financial world where no one cared about family names. Monroe, that was the name I used. My mother's maiden name. She died when I was 23, and sometimes I still think she left just in time. The first 6 months were a blur of long days and long silence. I met 2 young analysts through a mutual contact at Northwestern. Smart, hungry, sharp in the ways I wasn't. They knew Excel the way architects know blueprints. I taught them how to read leverage ratios like weather patterns, how to see risk as blood in the water. We started small minor equity positions in distressed logistics firms, low-profile salvage plays in Ohio and Indiana. We moved fast, cut deep, and got out clean. Our reputation grew beneath the radar. We weren't loud. We didn't sponsor galas or hire influencers or commission building-sized banners with our name. We just delivered returns. That was enough. By year 3, we had 6 clients and a line of credit that made real movement possible. By year 5, Mainspring Equity managed a portfolio in the low 9 figures, I watched companies rise and fall on our spreadsheets. I learned when to pull out, when to restructure, when to let a failing operation die quietly. I slept less. I felt more. All the while, I monitored Langford, not obsessively, just enough. I checked their permits, their public contracts, their legal filings. I read between lines. I saw how Elliot inherited momentum I'd built and mistook it for his own. I watched them overextend into mixed-use developments they didn't understand. Watched them bet on retail in the middle of a digital migration. Watched them lose clients they'd held for decades. I didn't intervene. I didn't speak. They weren't my concern. Until they were. The news came from an industry newsletter I didn't usually finish. Russell Langford, my father, hospitalized after a cardiac episode. The article was polite, just clinical enough to maintain privacy, just vague enough to feel like a signal. I refreshed the sex site the next morning. The filings confirmed it. Two key investors had withdrawn. Credit lines were frozen. One of the banks had moved to initiate a breach review. The house was burning. I wasn't surprised, but I also wasn't ready for the part of me that reacted quietly. But undeniably, it wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't pity. It was more like instinct. Like seeing an old machine falter in a familiar rhythm and knowing, without thinking, how to fix it. I scheduled a meeting with my core team. I told them what we were looking at. I didn't mention my family. Not yet. They responded with the efficiency I'd built them for. In 48 hours, we had a dossier 3 inches thick. Langford's finances were worse than reported. They had leased equipment with no buyout clauses, deferred taxes, hollow development deals, vendors unpaid for quarters. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was erosion. Still, it could be saved. Not easily, not cheaply, but structurally wasn't beyond repair. Their backlog still had value. Their labor network, though underpaid and increasingly fractured, remained loyal. The name Langford, however tainted, still meant something. In state contracting, I hadn't built Mainspring to rescue ghosts. But this wasn't a ghost. Not yet. Then came the letter. Arrived by courier, unsigned. A request, not an invitation, for me to attend a strategic consultation with the Langford board. No sentiment, no reference to the past, no acknowledgement of who I was or what I might now be. Just a time, a date, a building address I knew too well. I didn't respond immediately. I left the envelope on my kitchen counter, unopened for nearly 2 days. After reading it, I stared at it over espresso, over wine, over files I couldn't quite focus on. Mike asked, gently, if I planned to go. I didn't answer, but I knew I would. Not for closure, not for revenge, for clarity. I packed without urgency. 1 bag, a tailored charcoal blazer, a matte silk blouse, dark wool trousers, the watch I wore when I signed Mainspring's first acquisition. No diamonds, just weight. On the flight to Denver, I drafted 5 scenarios, each with a projected capital burn, each with a worst-case variable. I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. The Langford office building hadn't changed. The same red brick, the same bronze plaque on the front. Even the lobby smelled the same industrial carpet. Coffee burned half an hour past acceptable. The receptionist was new. She asked if I had an appointment. I gave my name, Caroline Langford. She paused, searched her screen, then gave me a visitor badge without recognition. That was fitting. I waited in the side lounge, across from the frosted glass doors that led to the conference wing. I watched interns hurry past, shoulders hunched, eyes on phones. Watched a manager bark at someone about a budget review. I wondered how many people in this building remembered what efficiency had once looked like. Elliot was the first familiar face. He walked past me without seeing, then stopped, turned. His expression shifted, first confusion, then something more guarded. He offered a nod, nothing more. I returned it. Bridget, the board's legal secretary, finally led me down a hallway I once knew better than my own apartment. We passed the executive suite, my old office now occupied by someone with Elliot's taste for glass and chrome. We passed the break room with the same leaking ice machine. I noticed every detail. That's the thing about memory. It doesn't fade, it brews. They placed me in a small auxiliary office off the main corridor. The room had no windows, a folding chair, a metal desk, and a shelf of unfiled compliance binders. I didn't speak. I didn't protest. I opened my laptop, connected to the building Wi-Fi, pulled the live filings. The meeting hadn't started yet. I still had time. I found a stack of internal memos left behind, outdated, forgotten, misfiled. But useful. They confirmed what I suspected. The debt was deeper. The vendor relationships had soured to legal action. One state permit had already been revoked. I highlighted everything. I time-stamped it. I prepared. They didn't know I was the one they were waiting for. But they would, soon. The night before the meeting, I stayed in a hotel downtown, one of the newer developments funded by a competitor Langford once tried to undercut. The irony wasn't lost on me. From my room, I could see the city I used to call home, the skyline, unchanged. But the meanings attached to it entirely different. Denver hadn't shrunk. I had simply outgrown the version of myself that once needed its approval. I went to bed early, though I didn't sleep. Not out of anxiety, just calculation. My mind moved through possibilities, not fears. I rehearsed. No confrontations. I expected no apologies. There were no names written in red, no scenarios marked revenge. That kind of emotion had burned off years ago. All that remained now was the exact shape of leverage. I woke before the sun. The room was still, the carpet quiet underfoot. I moved through my routine, methodically, clothing pressed the night before, hair pulled back with clinical precision, documents ordered and secured in a case built for depositions, not drama. I wore a tailored suit in slate blue, subtle but unforgiving, the kind of color that didn't soften anything. By 6:45, I was parked in the Langford lot. A few early employees filtered in, none of them looking twice at me. I entered through the main lobby like any other visitor. The badge from yesterday still worked upstairs. The floor buzzed with a kind of anxious optimism. Pastries arrived in white cardboard boxes. Coffee brewed too quickly. People whispered in low tones, checking screens, adjusting lighting in the boardroom. Someone struggled with a projector. Nothing unusual. But the pace just slightly too fast. The movements just slightly too careful. This wasn't confidence. This was performance. I stood by the window for a while, watching the parking lot fill. A black car pulled up, rented, not owned. Another followed, unmarked but expensive. The out-of-town investors, likely from California or New York, maybe Texas. The accents would give it away soon enough. They would come expecting a pitch. They would receive something else. I passed through the hall toward the boardroom, slowly, without drawing attention. My heels made no sound on the carpet. I carried no briefcase, just a thin folder. As if I had little to bring, Brannon, head of operations, was hunched over the laptop by the projector, clicking through a deck that looked fragile even from a distance. I approached, casually. He didn't look up right away. I waited. When he noticed me, he started to speak, then stopped himself. I didn't interrupt. He stepped aside slightly. Unsure whether to involve me, I didn't insist. Instead, I glanced at the slides, formulas that didn't track, charts misaligned with claims, forward projections that contradicted last quarter's results. No deception, just negligence. A presentation built on assumptions and appearance. I offered no comment, just one or two small notes on margins, inconsistencies, data sets. His reaction was immediate. Awareness, then hesitation. Not defense, just resignation. I didn't stay long. The hallway grew louder. Doors opened and closed. Elliot's voice carried through the corridor, louder than necessary to rehearsed. I stood aside as he passed. His stride exaggerated, his confidence brittle. He greeted several board members in a tone I remembered well, full of projection. Absent of substance, I made my way back toward the auxiliary office, the one they'd given me yesterday, the converted file room with the squeaking chair and the brittle air. It hadn't changed overnight. I didn't expect it to. The dust was still settled in the corners. The forgotten paperwork still stacked. Against the back wall, a box labeled 2006 bids still sat under the desk. No one had cleared it. No one had thought to. Melissa passed by briefly, his assistant. She paused, looked at me, seemed unsure whether to say anything. I gave her a nod. She returned it and kept walking. There was an apology in her silence. I didn't take it. I stayed in that room for 15 minutes, doing nothing, at least nothing visible. I didn't check my phone. I didn't adjust my files. I simply sat, back straight, one leg crossed, as if the room itself were a stage and I was waiting for the lights to rise. Eventually, someone knocked, not at my door, down the hall. Voices passed. I heard the investors rive shoes against tile, greetings exchanged, the room shifting into formal rhythm. Name cards were shuffled. Water glasses filled. Introductions made. Elliot's tone changed, again now softer, more restrained, the practiced humility of a man selling something fragile. I stayed seated. Through the thin walls, I heard the meeting begin. Elliot launched into the opening remarks. Gratitude, vision, optimism, the language of salvage dressed as innovation. I recognized the script. I'd seen it before in other rooms, with other names. It was always the same. Someone asked a question about financials, another about projected returns. His answers meandered, overconfident, then vague. There were too many numbers, then not enough. I rose slowly, removed my jacket, revealing the cleaner silhouette beneath. I adjusted the chain round my neck, mother's ring, still warm against my collarbone. I checked my watch. 5 minutes past the hour. The time was close. Outside the hallway, I could hear the air shift, the sound of disappointment not yet spoken, interest beginning to cool. The board murmured, pen scratched, coffee stirred. It was the pause between belief and doubt, the narrow opening in which reality could re-enter a room. I stepped toward the door. Behind me, the folding chair creaked back into stillness. The old filing box stayed untouched. The dust remained undisturbed. I placed one hand on the doorknob and waited, not out of hesitation, but because timing, in all things, was everything. The night before the meeting, I stayed in a hotel downtown, one of the newer developments funded by a competitor Langford once tried to undercut. The irony wasn't lost on me. From my room, I could see the city I used to call home, the skyline, unchanged, but the meanings attached to it entirely different. Denver hadn't shrunk. I had simply outgrown the version of myself that once needed its approval. I went to bed early, though I didn't sleep, not out of anxiety, just calculation. My mind moved through possibilities, not fears. I rehearsed. No confrontations. I expected no apologies. There were no names written in red, no scenarios marked revenge. That kind of emotion had burned off years ago. All that remained now was the exact shape of leverage. I woke before the sun. The room was still, the carpet quiet underfoot. I moved through my routine methodically, clothing pressed the night before, hair pulled back with clinical precision, documents ordered and secured in a case built for depositions, not drama. I wore a tailored suit in slate blue, subtle but unforgiving, the kind of color that didn't soften anything. By 6:45, I was parked in the Langford lot. A few early employees filtered in, none of them looking twice at me. I entered through the main lobby like any other visitor. The badge from yesterday still worked upstairs. The floor buzzed with a kind of anxious optimism. Pastries arrived in white cardboard boxes, coffee brewed too quickly. People whispered in low tones, checking screens, adjusting lighting in the boardroom. Someone struggled with a projector. Nothing unusual, but the pace just slightly too fast, the movements just slightly too careful. This wasn't confidence. This was performance. I stood by the window for a while, watching the parking lot fill. A black car pulled up, rented, not owned. Another followed, unmarked but expensive. The out-of-town investors, likely from California or New York, maybe Texas. The accents would give it away soon enough. They would come expecting a pitch. They would receive something else. I passed through the hall toward the boardroom, Slowly, without drawing attention. My heels made no sound on the carpet. I carried no briefcase, just a thin folder. As if I had little to bring, Brannon, head of operations, was hunched over the laptop by the projector, clicking through a deck that looked fragile even from a distance. I approached, casually. He didn't look up right away. I waited. When he noticed me, he started to speak, then stopped himself. I didn't interrupt. He stepped aside slightly. Unsure whether to involve me, I didn't insist. Instead, I glanced at the slides, formulas that didn't track, charts misaligned with claims, forward projections that contradicted last quarter's results. No deception, just negligence. A presentation built on assumptions and appearance. I offered no comment, just one or two small notes on margins, inconsistencies, data sets. His reaction was immediate. Awareness, then hesitation. Not defense, just resignation. I didn't stay long. The hallway grew louder. Doors opened and closed. Elliot's voice carried through the corridor louder than necessary to rehearse. I stood aside as he passed. His stride exaggerated, his confidence brittle. He greeted several board members in a tone I remembered well, full of projection. Absent of substance, I made my way back toward the auxiliary office, the one they'd given me yesterday, the converted file room with the squeaking chair and the brittle air. It hadn't changed overnight. I didn't expect it to. The dust was still settled in the corners. The forgotten paperwork still stacked against the back wall. A box labeled 2006 bids still sat under the desk. No one had cleared it. No one had thought to. Melissa passed by briefly, his assistant. She paused, looked at me, seemed unsure whether to say anything. I gave her a nod. She returned it and kept walking. There was an apology in her silence. I didn't take it. I stayed in that room for 15 minutes, doing nothing, at least nothing visible. I didn't check my phone. I didn't adjust my files. I simply sat, back straight, one leg crossed, as if the room itself were a stage and I was waiting for the lights to rise. Eventually, someone knocked, not at my door, down the hall. Voices passed. I heard the investors rive shoes against tile, greetings exchanged, the room shifting into formal rhythm. Name cards were shuffled. Water glasses filled. Introductions made. Elliot's tone changed. Again, now softer, more restrained. The practiced humility of a man selling something fragile. I stayed seated. Through the thin walls, I heard the meeting begin. Elliot launched into the opening remarks. Gratitude, vision, optimism, the language of salvage dressed as innovation. I recognized the script. I'd seen it before in other rooms, with other names. It was always the same. Someone asked a question about financials, another about projected returns. His answers meandered, overconfident, then vague. There were too many numbers, then not enough. I rose slowly, removed my jacket, revealing the cleaner silhouette beneath. I adjusted the chain round my neck, mother's ring, still warm against my collarbone. I checked my watch. 5 minutes past the hour. The time was close. Outside the hallway, I could hear the air shift, the sound of disappointment not yet spoken, interest beginning to cool. The board murmured, pen scratched, coffee stirred. It was the pause between belief and doubt, the narrow opening in which reality could re-enter a room. I stepped toward the door. Behind me, the folding chair creaked back into stillness. The old filing box stayed untouched. The dust remained undisturbed. I placed one hand on the doorknob and waited, not out of hesitation, but because timing, in all things, was everything. The door opened with the soft release of pressure, sunless against the gathering tension that had taken hold beyond it. I stepped into the room without announcement. 20 faces turned toward me, not all at once, but in a slow, rippling recognition that fractured whatever illusion of control had been established in the hour before. No one said my name, but I didn't need them to. At the far end of the room, Elliot's expression faltered, his mouth halfway through a sentence, the remote in his hand suspended in midair. One by one, the murmurs died, like a tide pulling back from the shore. Just before it turns violent, the silence was taut, not reverent, not fearful, just suspended. I walked the length of the room with deliberate steps, neither hurried nor hesitant. The rhythm was precise. My presence, by then, had become the disruption they hadn't accounted for. I placed a slim card on the polished table, nothing ornate, just embossed with the name of my firm and my current title. There was no need for introductions. The investors could read. Across from me, Fitzgerald Langford's most senior board member reached for the card. His fingers trembled, just slightly, when his eyes met the print. The breath caught in his chest, visible even from where I stood. He looked up, then down again, then leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something I didn't need to hear to understand. The rest followed, one by one. Glances shifted from me to the card, to their tablets, and then, finally, to Elliot. His face had drained of color, his stance subtly receding. The illusion that had held the room together a moment earlier was unraveling thread by thread, posture by posture. Someone near the projector leaned back in their chair. Another board member shifted uneasily. Two of the visiting investors, previously seated in performative ease, straightened in unison. Pages turned. Coffee went untouched. No one asked questions. No one made eye contact with Elliot now. I did not raise my voice. I did not take the head seat. I simply opened the folder I carried and laid it in front of me. Page by page, line by line. Each document slid across the lacquered surface like a quiet indictment. Accounts payable in arrears. Vendor contracts terminated. Capital project overruns. A legal memorandum regarding the pending permit suspension. Nothing exaggerated, nothing editorialized, just data. In sequence, I narrated with restraint, offering a clear timeline of operational decline. The expansion initiative that had drained 40% of liquidity with no ROI. The staffing cuts that reduced field oversight and spiked claims. The missed tax deadlines and quiet settlement payments that never reached the board. Each item landed without ceremony. There were no raised voices, just a growing unease. Across the table, a younger board member newly appointed drew in a slow, audible breath. She tapped something into her tablet, then looked at Fitzgerald. His face had gone completely still, like a man revisiting a decision he now regretted. Elliot began to speak, at first low, almost inaudible, then louder, insistent, his words rushing ahead of his sense. He leaned forward, pointing, trying to reclaim the room with the force of his voice, but the tone lacked conviction. He threw out accusations, old ones, desperate ones, about loyalty, abandonment, betrayal. He framed the past as justification, tried to reroute the narrative before it completely slipped from his hands. I did not respond. I allowed the room to absorb his panic without giving it an anchor. What broke the moment wasn't his voice, but another Brandon's. He stood, quiet until then, and confirmed what I had just presented. He spoke in short, measured terms. There was no fire in his tone, no alliance implied, just acknowledgement that the systems had failed, that warnings were given, that no one had listened. The room reset itself in the space between Brandon's final sentence and my father's entrance. He moved slowly, more fragile than the man I remembered, but with a weight that still held the perimeter. No one spoke as he made his way to an empty chair, not the head, but near the center. He sat without ceremony, looked at no one in particular, then nodded slightly, as if to give the floor back to me. I offered my analysis next, not of what had gone wrong, but what remained salvageable. The core operation still had measurable yield. The workforce, though diminished, retained technical skill. The Langford brand, diluted but not dissolved, could still carry weight in the right big contexts. I laid out conditions: immediate capital infusion from Mainspring in exchange for controlling State, complete restructuring of executive leadership, implementation of strict operational benchmarks, performance over proximity, metrics over inheritance. There was no resistance from the board. Elliot attempted to object again. This time, the room didn't follow him, not even Kyle, seated near the door. whose gaze remained fixed on the surface of his coffee. My father did not defend Elliot, nor did he praise me. He merely spoke a truth none of them had voiced, that he had watched the company falter, that he had rationalized the decline under the weight of tradition, that he had followed my work from a distance, file by file, press release by press release, that in failing to recognize merit where it was owed, he had not only weakened the business but something far more difficult to repair. He stopped short of an apology, but his presence, his stillness, the absence of denial was enough. The board shifted, not suddenly, but definitively. Questions began, this time directed at me, projections, deadlines, expectations. None of them asked why I had returned. None asked how I had built Mainspring. Those answers were irrelevant now. The vote was quick, unanimous. The room moved into action almost immediately. Assistants filed in. Legal counsel retrieved draft agreements. Laptops opened. Voices rose not in chaos, but in purpose. Elliot sat alone, unmoving, the remote still in his hand. A man bypassed, not by accident, but by architecture. I did not look at him again. I gathered my folder, nodded once toward Fitzgerald, and stepped out of the room, filled with the sound of a company turning itself inside out. In the hallway, Melissa waited. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The shape of her smile said everything. Downstairs, the lobby buzzed with murmurs I didn't bother parsing. Outside, the wind had picked up. I felt it against my collar, sharp and familiar. The air tasted like iron, like clarity, like something old giving way to something earned. The days that followed moved with a momentum I recognized, though this time it wasn't mine alone. At 8 the next morning, I returned to the Langford offices not through the service entrance or as a visitor, but leading a small team from Mainspring who arrived precisely on schedule. They carried nothing flashy, no branded folders or declarations, just clipped briefcases, quiet efficiency, and the weight of institutional knowledge. We didn't need to announce ourselves. Everyone already knew. The elevator ride was silent. The hallway, less so. Conversations paused as we passed. Employees stepped aside. I heard my name in lowered voices, rarely attached to questions anymore, mostly to certainty. The boardroom had been rearranged since the vote. Someone had swapped out the floral arrangements. The coffee service had improved. The details said enough. People were adapting fast. Self-preservation could be a powerful motivator. Elliot was already seated when we entered. He didn't stand. I acknowledged him only briefly. He kept his eyes on a folder he never opened. Cal was there too, smiling too quickly, nodding too often. I didn't engage. Brandon, on the other hand, waited quietly at the end of the table. When I sat, he passed me a revised infrastructure report. No commentary, no embellishments. The numbers had been corrected. The assumptions were now grounded. For the next 3 hours, we walked through a full operational audit. Each department was laid bare: cash flows, staffing structures, outdated processes. I didn't assign blame. I named facts. Those willing to listen took notes. Those unwilling fell silent. That was enough. The weeks that followed were harder. Resistance came, not in the form of confrontation, but in small, persistent acts. Delayed responses, withheld updates, passive deferrals wrapped in politeness. Elliot misdirected a client file. Cal forgot to forward a contract amendment. An operations manager circulated a rumor about asset liquidation. Nothing substantial, nothing provable, just friction meant to wear me down through inconvenience. It didn't work. I handled it the way I always had. In writing, in structure, in policy, I issued accountability metrics, not threats. I replaced personalities with systems. Slowly, the environment recalibrated. The noise faded. I met with department leads individually, always behind closed doors, always recorded. Some came prepared, some defensive. A few arrived with nothing but silence and waited to be told what would become of them. I didn't offer guarantees, only criteria. Those who adapted stayed. Those who didn't quietly disappeared from the org chart. Brandon emerged as the quiet center of transformation. With access to proper resources, he built a new digital framework in weeks. Workflows accelerated. Miscommunications dropped. Budget leaks that had gone unnoticed for years closed almost overnight. His team expanded, not through headcount but through capability. No one had expected it, least of all him. Kyle, predictably, shifted with the wind. Once he saw the new order solidify, he latched on eager, overly helpful, volunteering ideas that weren't his. I allowed it. Sometimes utility outweighed authenticity. His charm worked better under limits. Elliot posed the final problem. He resisted more subtly, reframed decisions to stakeholders in a language I hadn't authorized, claimed influence where none existed, framed compliance as collaboration. He played to sentiment of others, the legacy staffs. At first, I let him move unchecked. I wanted to observe the shape of his resistance. But when a long-standing client nearly pulled a contract after being misled by Elliot's assurances, I intervened, not with confrontation, with record. I documented the deviation, the client's complaint, the financial risk. I called him into what used to be his office. I presented the facts. I asked nothing. I stated everything. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He simply nodded once and left the room. After that, the sabotage stopped. Not because he understood, but because he finally realized I wasn't playing a part he could disrupt. Outside the company, the narrative was shifting. Industry publications began referring to Langford's restructuring with cautious optimism. Mainspring's role was noted, in the footnotes discreet, understated, influential. Trade associations invited me to speak. I declined, not out of pride, but preference. My work didn't require microphones, it required results. Former rivals reached out, not to gloat, to offer collaboration. A regional competitor proposed a joint bid on an infrastructure project. A supplier we cut ties with 3 years prior asked to be reconsidered. They didn't mention the past. I didn't offer forgiveness. We moved forward, on paper. Our financials stabilized within the quarter. Losses slowed, then stopped. Client trust didn't return all at once, but in signal short emails, quiet renewals, referrals without ceremony. Confidence wasn't declared. It was extended. Internally, the air changed. Meetings started on time. People prepared. No one apologized for being early. The offices were quieter, not out of fear, but focus. Employees stopped glancing over their shoulders. They started asking questions again, not for approval, but clarity. Trust had not been rebuilt, but structure had, and structure carried weight. My father began attending weekly updates. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was brief context, clarification, occasional insights from earlier decades. He never challenged. He never praised. I didn't expect him to. One afternoon, after a particularly detailed review, he waited as others filed out. He lingered at the edge of the room, then placed a folder on a table. It was worn, slightly bent at the edges. Inside, an old business plan I had written at 23. I recognized the formatting before the words. I remembered the pitch modular construction systems for rural development. He had dismissed it then. Now, he offered it back. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. I kept the folder. I didn't thank him. In time, small acknowledgments emerged. A project manager left a handwritten note after a successful rollout. The staff cafeteria added to extra vegetarian options, something I had quietly requested years ago, long before I left. My parking space was reassigned without my asking. The nameplate on my office door changed just slightly. The font updated. The title simplified. Subtle shifts, not declarations, but recognition. Nonetheless, at home, my routine remained unchanged. I kept the same apartment, same alarm, same hours. But something beneath the surface began to loosen, not dissolve, but reconfigure. I noticed I read the paper more slowly, allowed myself a second cup of coffee before responding to emails. I walked longer in the evenings, not for reflection, just because I could. The past no longer clung. It followed. But at a distance, I didn't need it to vanish. I just needed it to stay behind me. It was a gray morning in early October when the letter arrived. Heavy paper, understated seal, a formal invitation from the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, my alma mater. They were hosting their annual leadership symposium and had selected me as their closing keynote. The note was brief. It didn't mention Langford. It didn't mention the years I spent building Mainspring. It simply asked if I'd be willing to share the architecture of resilience. I left the envelope on the corner of my desk for 2 days before responding. Not out of uncertainty, but consideration. I declined these invitations before panels, interviews, guest lectures. There was always another turnaround underway, another deal to complete. But this one felt different, not because of the platform, because of the timing. The Langford merger had finalized 6 weeks earlier. A quiet transaction, no headlines, no staged photo ops. Langford Construction was now a subsidiary of Mainspring Equity, its branding restructured, its operations streamlined. The family name remained etched on certain blueprints, but the decision-making had shifted entirely. Ellie had accepted his role as a senior advisor. Cull had settled into a regional sales capacity. Brandon, now CTO, led monthly innovation briefings with an authority that no longer surprised anyone, and my father, though no longer formally involved, still visited the office twice a month. He brought no files, just questions. Sometimes he stayed to listen. Other times he left without a word. There was no sentiment between us, but there was clarity. The night of the symposium, the auditorium was full, rows of clean, polished wood. The air smelled faintly of paper and wool. Most of the attendees were students, eager, angular, notebooks open on their laps. A few familiar faces from industry sat near the back, their expressions unreadable. I wore black, no statement, just form. When they introduced me, the applause was polite but expectant, not reverent, not skeptical, just open. I walked to the podium without notes. The lights were bright, but not blinding. I could see the first few rows clearly, faces tilted upward, pens paused mid-page. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't mention the storage room. I didn't recount the names of those who had shut me out or underestimated me. I didn't list revenue milestones or highlight deal structures. Instead, I spoke of patterns, of quiet decisions, of how power often arrives not in the moment of acquisition, but in the moments where you choose not to demand it. I spoke of stillness, of building something unseen for years, not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove yourself right. They listened closely, not because I dramatized, because I did and single quotes T. Afterward, people approached. Not many, just a few. A young woman from Minnesota asked if I ever felt like leaving again. I told her it wasn't about leaving or staying. It was about whether the place you stood was finally solid beneath your feet. A few days later, the transcript circulated, edited for clarity, published in the school's journal. A colleague forwarded it to me with no comment, just a subject line. It found its way. I let the message sit unread for hours, though I'd already taken in every word. Weeks passed. Mainspring's board formalized our next phase, a selective expansion into public infrastructure. The team reorganized. I traveled less. I spent more time in the office, though I no longer needed to. The systems now ran without friction. That was the real measure of leadership. When presence becomes optional. One evening, as the sun set behind the South Loop, I found myself in my office, once Elliot's, once my father's, now entirely mine. I stood by the window, watching cranes move steel across the skyline. They reminded me of something from long before balance sheets and quarterly briefings. A memory of drawing buildings in the margins of schoolwork, of imagining spaces no one had yet built, not for approval, just to see if they could hold. Behind me, on the shelf, sat the old portfolio my father had given back, the one with my early proposal for modular housing. I hadn't opened it since the day he placed it in my hands. I didn't need to. The proof had long since moved beyond the page. Later that month, a handwritten letter arrived from a former client, one we had rescued early in Mainspring's growth. A small manufacturing firm in Akron, they were retiring the brand, selling to a new generation. In the final paragraph, the owner wrote that it wasn't the money we'd given them that had saved the business. It was the discipline, the clarity, the refusal to compromise when things felt uncertain. That stayed with me. Not as praise. As affirmation. I responded with one sentence. It was never about the storm. It was always about the structure, and sometimes I think that's what growth really is, not the distance from where you started, but the steadiness with which you hold your ground when the winds return. **** Sometimes. The hardest battles are the ones we fight without witnesses. When you're underestimated, overlooked, or quietly dismissed, not with malice, but with something colder, indifference. You don't always get a dramatic confrontation or a clear moment of justice. Often, what you get instead is silence and the space to build something no one can take from you. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about proving them wrong. It's about proving yourself right. In a world that once refused to see your worth, it's about the quiet power of staying the course, of knowing who you are long before anyone else does. And when the time comes, stepping forward, not to demand recognition, but to offer clarity. Not every redemption is loud. Not every victory looks like triumph. Sometimes it looks like stability, like being asked, not ignored, trusted, not tested. So maybe the real question is this: when the room finally turns and listens, what will you say? And more importantly, who will you be when you no longer need to explain why you deserve to be there? ***.